If you borrow, you must repay.
Right.
When you hear that phrase out loud, it just sounds like basic, undeniable morality, doesn't it? Like, it feels like gravity.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
feels like the golden rule. You take something from someone, you give it back. I mean, it's the foundation of just being a responsible human being. Entire civilizations treat debt as a simple moral obligation. But what if the very system that defines debt was engineered to turn social relationships into instruments of extraction?
Which is a huge question because it completely flips our understanding of right and wrong totally on its head.
It really does. Welcome to Crisis in Perception, by the way, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I mean, we naturally like things to be clean and categorized, especially when it comes to finances.
Oh, for sure. We want a ledger to be objective, but when you actually trace the history of debt, the landscape is incredibly murky. And that so-called objective ledger is usually hiding something, well, much darker.
And that is exactly why we are jumping into this today. Because you, the listener, when you sent us this stack of sources and asked us to unpack the history of debt, you made it clear you wanted to understand the hidden architecture of the world.
Right. No dry academic jargon.
Exactly. You wanted to know why things work the way they do. So for this deep dive, we are looking primarily at David Graeber's incredibly dense, really eye-opening work, Debt, the First 5,000 Years.
It's quite a book.
It's massive. And our mission today is to strip away the conventional economic myths we were all taught in school. We're going to look at how finance, states, military power, and our deepest cultural narratives about right and wrong are just completely tangled together.
Yeah, and before we get started, I think it's really important to lay down a brief disclaimer here.
Go for it.
The source material you've asked us to explore today contains some very strong critiques of modern capitalist institutions, like the International Monetary Fund, for example.
The IMF, right?
Right, the IMF, as well as global power structures, including U.S. foreign policy. So our goal here today is strictly analytical. We are not endorsing the author's political viewpoints, and we aren't taking sides on these politically charged issues.
Yeah, we're just the messengers here.
Exactly. We are neutrally exploring his historical framework. The aim is just to help you view the systems shaping our world through a completely new, deeply historical lens.
Perfect. So I want to start with something that really jumped out at me from the notes, because before we go back 5,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia or whatever, the text argues we have to look at how debt functions psychologically in the modern world right now.
Yeah, the modern psychology of it is fascinating.
It is. And it makes this wild claim that debt takes systemic violence and somehow disguises it as personal morality. So can you walk me through how that actually works?
Yeah, so the author gives a really brilliant real-world anecdote to illustrate exactly this mechanism. He describes being at a garden party at Westminster Abbey in London.
Okay, fancy.
Right. And he falls into a conversation with an activist lawyer. Now, this is a woman whose entire professional life is dedicated to providing legal support for anti-poverty groups.
So she's deeply aware of inequality.
Highly aware. She's seen social struggle firsthand. Anyway, she asks him what he's been working on, and he mentions his involvement in the global justice movement and their efforts to abolish the IMF.
Okay, wait, stop right there. Abolish the IMF.
Yeah.
That sounds like a massive, radical goal. I mean, I know the IMF is this huge global institution, but for those of us who aren't economists, what exactly do they do that makes them the target of an abolition campaign?
Well, to understand that, you have to look at how the IMF has historically functioned as essentially the world's debt enforcer. The text walks through this really specific historical sequence.
Okay, lay it on me.
Back in the 1970s, during the oil crisis, Western banks were suddenly just flooded with cash from oil-producing nations.
Right, the petrodollars.
Exactly. They needed to invest this money somewhere, so they sent agents all over the world, practically begging third-world leaders to take out massive loans.
Wait, begging them. I thought banks were usually pretty stingy with loans.
Normally, yes. But they had all this excess liquidity, and sovereign nations were considered safe bets because, theoretically, a country can't go bankrupt.
Oh, I see. A country always has taxpayers.
Right. But then, in the 1980s, U.S. monetary policy shifted drastically. The U.S. tightened its money supply to fight domestic inflation, and global interest rates just skyrocketed.
Like, how high are we talking?
We're talking up to 20%.
Wow, 20% on a national loan.
Yeah. So suddenly, those poor countries that had taken out loans at manageable rates were trapped in this massive, unpayable debt crisis. The interest was compounding way faster than their entire economies were growing.
That sounds like a complete trap. So what does the IMF have to do with this?
So, when these countries were on the verge of default, the IMF would step in to offer emergency refinancing. But, and this is the key part, this refinancing came with strict conditions, known as structural adjustment policies.
Structural adjustment. I mean, that sounds so clinical and harmless. What does it actually mean for the people living there?
It means severe austerity. The IMF would demand that these poor countries abandon price supports on basic food items, cut funding for free healthcare clinics/education budgets
Just getting the social safety net.
completely, because the primary goal of the country's economy had to be shifted toward exporting goods to earn dollars, specifically so they could pay back the Western banks.
Man. So back to the garden party.
Right, so the author tells this poverty lawyer that his group's long-term goal is to simply abolish third world debt entirely. Just a clean slate.
Okay. And how does she react? Because you'd think someone who fights poverty for a living would be thrilled by that idea.
That's what you'd think. But she is staggered. She physically reacts with shock, and she says, but they'd borrowed the money. Surely one has to pay one's debts.
Surely one has to pay one's debts. Wow. That is so deeply ingrained.
Exactly. It doesn't sound like an economic statement, does it? It sounds like a moral one.
Totally. It frames refusing to pay a debt as the ultimate shirking of personal responsibility.
Yes, but the text points out the sheer absurdity of this when you look at the real-world consequences on the ground. Like, the author lived in Madagascar, where there had been an outbreak of malaria.
Oh, Madagascar.
Yeah, and it took a relatively small amount of money to maintain a mosquito eradication and monitoring program. But because of the IMF-imposed austerity measures, the government had to cut that monitoring program.
Wait, because they had to pay the debt.
Yes. The austerity measures dictated that government funds must be diverted to service foreign debt.
Oh, no.
So they cut the program, and 10,000 people died.
You're kidding. 10,000 people.
10,000 human lives were lost, essentially to ensure that a massive international bank wouldn't have to cut its losses on a bad loan.
That is, I mean, that's just horrifying.
And here's the real kicker. That original loan was often made to a corrupt dictator who likely put the money straight into a private Swiss bank account anyway.
So the people who died didn't even see the money.
Not a dime. The ordinary people of Madagascar never saw any benefit, but they paid the ultimate price to service the interest.
That completely changes the context of paying one's debts. You're basically saying that the moral imperative to pay a bank back trumped the moral imperative to keep 10,000 innocent people alive.
That is the exact tension the author is highlighting. And this brings up a stark contrast detailed in the sources between what we might call Cadillac debtors and pauper debtors.
Okay, a pauper debtor, that would be Madagascar.
Exactly. Or consider Haiti.
Oh, man. I read that section in the notes you sent, and I genuinely had to read it twice to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Can you explain the Haitian debt for the listeners? Because it sounds genuinely unbelievable.
It really is one of the most glaring examples of this dynamic. So in the late 18th century, the enslaved people of Haiti successfully rebelled.
Right, the Haitian Revolution.
Yes, they defeated the French colonial forces and founded a free republic. But decades later, France sent warships and demanded an indemnity of 150 million francs.
Wait, what were they demanding compensation for? I mean, they lost a war.
They demanded it for damages. And the primary damage was the loss of property. Meaning the French planters wanted to be compensated for the loss of the slaves. France was literally demanding that the Haitian people pay for the crime of freeing themselves.
So they were forced to buy their own freedom, retroactively, from the people who had enslaved them. That's insane.
Yes. And it was an intentionally impossible sum. It's equivalent to billions of dollars today. To pay it, Haiti had to take out exorbitant loans from French banks.
So they just traded physical chains for financial chains.
Exactly. This placed the entire nation in a state of permanent debt peonage for over a century, crippling their economic development. When a pauper debtor owes money, the enforcement is utterly ruthless.
But then the text compares this to the United States and calls the U.S. the ultimate Cadillac debtor. What does that mean?
Well, the U.S. has accrued national debts that dwarf the debts of the entire Third World combined. But that debt takes a very different form. It largely exists as treasury bonds held by institutional investors in countries that are functionally U.S. military protectorates.
Like where?
Places like Germany, Japan, and South Korea. The U.S. deficit spending largely funds the military apparatus that covers those very countries.
Let me see if I have this straight. The U.S. borrows billions from other countries and then uses that money to maintain military bases inside those same countries.
That's the structural reality, yes. Historically, if a massive military power demanded money from subject peoples to fund its imperial armies, we would call that tribute.
Right, like the Romans demanding gold from Gaul.
But today, because of the complex financial instruments involved, it's called a loan. It is a remarkable double standard.
It really is.
When a Cadillac debtor owes money, it's treated as a secure global investment. The U.S. isn't forced to shut down its hospitals to pay its creditors, but when a pauper debtor owes money, they're lectured on their own moral irresponsibility, even while their citizens literally starve to make the math work.
Okay, but surely the lenders, the banks, know what they are doing. Why does society give them a free pass while vilifying the debtors? Has it always been this way?
Not at all. And this is a crucial historical point. For most of human history, the lenders were not the ones holding the moral high ground. In fact, for centuries, lenders were the ones subjected to intense moral panic.
Wait, really? People used to think the creditors were the bad guys.
Oh, absolutely. Across almost all major world religions and traditions, the text mentions how in medieval Europe, the Catholic Church strictly forbade charging interest. They categorized it as the sin of usury.
Usury, right?
Mendicant friars would travel from town to town preaching fire and brimstone, warning usurers that they were going straight to hell.
You know, the notes mentioned a really bizarre story about a medieval usurer and a donkey.
Yes, it perfectly captures the medieval mindset. So, there's a historical account of a wealthy medieval usurer who died. His friends and family wanted him to be buried in consecrated ground, in the churchyard.
Makes sense.
But the local priest refused. He said the man's money was tainted by sin. The townspeople argued, so the priest proposed a test. He said they would put the man's corpse on the back of a donkey and let God decide where he belonged.
And what happened?
The donkey walked straight out of town, directly to the gallows where criminals were hanged, and bucked the corpse right into a pile of dung underneath it.
Wow. That is incredibly vivid, and the implication is that society viewed making money from money as essentially criminal, or at least deeply unnatural.
Exactly. And we see very similar themes in other cultural traditions. Like in medieval Japan, there is a famous karmic tale about a woman named Haramushim.
Hiramushim.
Yeah. She was the wealthy wife of a district governor and an absolutely ruthless creditor.
What made her so ruthless?
The story goes that she would lend out rice to desperate peasants during the lean month, but she used a deceptive trick. She had a small measuring cup that she used when lending the rice out, and a massive measuring cup that she used when collecting the repayments.
Oh, that is evil.
Yeah, she would effectively charge up to 100 times the original loan, showing zero mercy to families who were starving.
So she was using the mechanics of debt to siphon everything they had.
Right. And according to the karmic legend, when she died, she was punished for her greed by being reborn as a horned ox, forced to eat tough grass and lie in her own excrement, completely a beast of burden for the rest of her existence.
Okay, so this is blowing my mind a little bit. We have this incredible historical tension. For thousands of years, lending money at interest is seen as this vile, unnatural sin. You get buried in dung, you get reincarnated as an ox. But today, paying your debts to a massive financial institution is seen as the ultimate test of your moral character. How did the script flip so completely?
To understand that, the author frames the tension with a really illustrative analogy. He references an old vaudeville joke by the comedian Steve Wright.
Okay, I love Steve Wright. How does the joke go?
Let's walk through it. A guy is walking down the street with his friend, Fred. Suddenly, a robber jumps out of an alley, points a gun at them, and says, "Stick 'em up. Give me all your money."
Classic mugging scenario.
Right. Now, the guy realizes he has absolutely no choice. He's going to lose all the cash in his wallet. But he remembers he owes Fred some money. So while the gun is pointed at him, he calmly pulls a $50 bill out of his wallet, hands it to his friend Fred, and says, "Hey, Fred, here's that $50 I owe you."
That is hilarious. He's paying his debts right before he gets robbed.
But here's the punchline and the philosophical core of the joke. The robber gets so deeply offended by this technical loophole, by the guy using the robbery to clear his conscience, that the robber pulls $1,000 of his own money out of his pocket, hands it to Fred at gunpoint, and forces Fred to lend it back to the guy.
Wait, what?
And then the robber steals it back.
He forces him to make a loan at gunpoint.
Yes. And the author uses this absurdity to ask a very serious question. What is the actual structural difference between a gangster demanding extortion money at gunpoint and that same gangster forcing you to take a loan at gunpoint and demanding repayment?
Well, if the gun is still there, there is no difference. It's just extortion with extra paperwork.
Exactly. The point is that the only difference between a violent extortionist and a legitimate creditor is the institutional framework backing them up. The legal system, the police, the courts.
So you're saying the math of the debt is just a polite cover story for the threat of force?
The text argues that what's truly fascinating here is how money's ability to quantify an obligation completely transforms human interaction. It turns messy morality into impersonal arithmetic.
Impersonal arithmetic.
Think about it. If you owe someone a favor, or say someone saves your life, and you owe them a debt of gratitude, that obligation is uniquely tied to that specific person. You have to consider their needs, their feelings, their situation. It's a relationship.
Right. If my brother helps me build a deck, I owe him big time. But I don't owe him a specific numerical amount of deck building. I just know I have to be there for him when he needs help moving or whatever.
Precisely. But the moment a promise becomes a precise number, say, $40,000 at 12% interest, it becomes cold, objective, and transferable. It removes the need to calculate human effects.
Wow.
The creditor who holds the paper doesn't need to care if the debtor's children are starving or if the country has a malaria outbreak. They only need to calculate principal and interest.
It's like the math acts as a shield against empathy. If I'm just looking at a spreadsheet, I don't have to look at a human face.
That is exactly the mechanism. The physical violence of the enforcement, the police evicting you from your home, or the state cutting off your water, is hidden behind the objective, unfeeling math.
That's chilling.
The morality of paying one's debts is weaponized. It creates a dynamic where the victim of systemic extraction actually feels morally responsible for their own ruin. They blame themselves because they failed to uphold the math, rather than questioning the system that imposed the math in the first place.
Okay, this is a massive paradigm shift. If the morality of debt is just a constructed illusion hiding this arithmetic of extraction, I have a very basic question.
Go ahead.
Where did this arithmetic actually come from? Because if humans started out dealing in favors and relationships, how do we get to spreadsheets and interest rates?
To answer that, we have to transition to the foundational myth of modern economics. We have to look at the story we are all told about how money was invented, and we have to completely smash it.
You mean the story of barter?
Yes! The illusion of barter. This is critical because the story of money that you find in every Economics 101 textbook always begins in a fantasy world.
Right. Adam Smith's Land of Barter. I remember this from high school. The standard narrative makes perfect logical sense when you first hear it.
Oh, absolutely.
It goes like this. Early humans were primitive, so they traded things directly. Henry grows potatoes. Joshua makes shoes. Henry needs shoes, so he takes a sack of potatoes to Joshua. But there's a problem. What if Joshua doesn't want potatoes? He wants firewood. It's what economists call the double coincidence of wants.
The double coincidence of wants.
You have to find someone who has exactly what you want and who wants exactly what you have.
It sounds incredibly inconvenient.
It's exactly. So according to the textbook, these early humans cleverly got together and invented money for the sake of efficiency. They picked something rare and durable, like silver or gold, and agreed it had universal value. Now Henry can sell his potatoes to anyone for silver and take that silver to Joshua for shoes. Boom. Money is born. Markets are born. And then much later, as society got more complex, they invented credit and debt.
It is a perfectly logical, neat, progressive story. It champions human ingenuity and the natural desire to trade. The only problem with the story is that it is completely, factually false.
Wait, completely false. You're saying humans didn't start by bartering? But it makes so much sense. What about trading a cow for magic beans? It's in all our stories. Are you saying Adam Smith literally just made it up out of thin air?
He essentially deduced it as a logical thought experiment, but he had no anthropological evidence to back it up. And over the last century, anthropologists have actually gone out and studied societies that don't use currency.
And what do they find?
Well, the definitive work on this was done by an anthropologist named Caroline Humphrey at Cambridge University. Her conclusion, after reviewing all the global ethnographic data, is absolute. A pure barter economy has never existed anywhere. Ever.
Never. Not in a single tribe anywhere in the world. But when missionaries and colonial administrators went out into the world with Adam Smith's book under their arm, expecting to find these lands of barter, What did they find?
They found complex systems of credit. Historically, virtual money, meaning credit systems, ledgers, and IOUs came first. Physical coins came thousands of years later.
Hold on, let me stop you. I'm struggling to visualize this. If they didn't have coins and they weren't swapping potatoes for shoes on the spot, how on earth did a blacksmith get his groceries? Was everyone just giving things away for free in some utopian commune?
Not exactly. In real human communities, villages, tribes, small towns, everyday economics operates on mutual credit and ongoing social obligations. When anthropologists observe these societies, they don't see people haggling over how many chickens equal one cow. They see everyone in debt to everyone else in a dozen different ways.
Okay, I think I need an analogy to grasp this, because my modern brain is so wired for cash.
Let's use a modern scenario to illustrate the psychology of it. Imagine you are interacting with your next-door neighbor. Let's say you're baking a cake, and you realize you are short 3 eggs. You walk next door, knock, and ask your neighbor if you can borrow some. They gladly hand over 3 eggs.
Okay, standard neighborly behavior.
Now imagine if you took those eggs and immediately reached into your pocket, pulled out your phone, checked the current market price of a dozen eggs, did the math, and handed your neighbor exactly 85 cents in exact change. How is your neighbor going to react?
They would look at me like I was a psychopath. They would be deeply offended.
Why? Why is it offensive to pay exactly what something is worth?
Because by handing them the exact change right then and there, I am treating them like a vending machine. I'm essentially terminating the relationship. I'm saying, we are square, our interaction is over, I owe you nothing, you owe me nothing, we have no ongoing ties.
That is a perfect illustration of how ancient societies viewed exchange. The text cites the Tiv women of rural Nigeria to show how this works in practice. If a neighbor brings a gift of a few tomatoes or a handful of peanuts, the recipient knows they must eventually return a favor, but they will never hand over the exact equivalent value.
Because that would be the vending machine insult.
Exactly. They might wait a week and then walk miles to give back a handful of okra or a tiny bit of change, deliberately making sure the return gift is either slightly more or slightly less than the original gift.
Oh, to keep the ledger unbalanced?
Yes, the whole point is to keep the ledger unbalanced. They want to keep what they call the endless circle of gifts going. If you pay the exact equivalent, you are closing the account. You are effectively saying you don't want to be neighbors anymore.
That is fascinating.
Yep.
So the debt itself, the fact that I owe you a little and you owe me a little, is the glue that holds the community together. It's a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. So if you think about it, barter, the direct, immediate exchange of exact equivalents without any ongoing trust, is actually deeply antisocial behavior in a traditional community.
So if barter isn't how neighbors interact, when does it actually happen? Because people do barter sometimes, right?
Barter really only happens between people who don't trust each other. It happens between strangers or enemies who meet on the road, where neither side wants an ongoing relationship, and both sides want to make sure they aren't getting cheated before they walk away.
Or, I imagine it happens when the money system we are used to suddenly breaks down.
Yes, ironically, barter is most common in modern societies where people are already completely used to using cash, but the cash supply suddenly collapses. We saw widespread barter in Russia in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, or in Argentina during their economic collapse in 2002.
Or like in prison movies.
Or, famously, in prisoner of war camps during World War II, where inmates used cigarettes as a standard currency. Barter isn't the ancient origin of money. It's what happens when people who already know how money and markets work are forced to make do without the physical currency.
Okay, this is a huge realization. If early human neighbors weren't swapping coins or bartering and everything was just this ongoing web of mutual credit and slightly unbalanced favors, how did we get from that to cold, hard cash? How did impersonal markets, where we treat everyone like a vending machine, become the bedrock of human society?
The answer to that is surprisingly violent. It lies in the machinations of war and the rise of the early state. This brings us to a concept known as the state theory of money, or chartalism.
Whoa, chartalism. That's a heavy academic word. Let's make sure we unpack that. Are you essentially saying that markets didn't just naturally evolve out of human nature?
Exactly. Chartalism argues that markets didn't emerge spontaneously because humans have a natural propensity to truck and barter, as Adam Smith claimed. Markets were deliberately engineered by early governments. They were forced into existence to solve a massive logistical crisis.
What was the crisis?
The crisis of feeding an army. Imagine you are an ancient king, say, in ancient Greece or early Rome or India. You have managed to raise a standing army of 50,000 armed men. Now you have a massive problem. Feeding that many soldiers in antiquity is a logistical nightmare.
I can imagine. 50,000 guys burning thousands of calories marching around. They would strip a landscape bare.
They will eat everything within a 10-mile radius in a matter of days. In the ancient world, before modern supply chains, you would need an army of slow-moving supply wagons, pulled by oxen that also need to eat, just to keep the army from starving or mutinying. It's almost impossible to project power far from your borders if you have to carry all your food.
Okay, so how does a king solve that? He can't just tell the soldiers to go knock on peasants' doors and ask for a mutual credit arrangement. The peasants don't want 50,000 heavily armed strangers joining their endless circle of gifts.
Exactly. So the ancient workaround was brutally brilliant. The king controls the local silver or gold mines. He takes that metal, mints it into identical coins, and stamps his own face on them. He then hands these coins out to his soldiers as their pay.
Okay, but a coin isn't food. The soldier can't eat the silver. How does that help feed them?
This is the genius part. The king then declares a new law. Every family in the kingdom must pay a tax at the end of the year, and that tax can only be paid using those specific coins he just minted.
Oh, that is incredibly devious. It's exactly like a casino. When you walk into a casino, they won't let you bet with cash. They force you to play with their proprietary chips. The king is forcing the entire country to play with his chips.
That's a great analogy. By demanding the tax in his own coin, the king essentially outsources the entire logistical burden of the military onto the peasantry. Think about the mechanics of what happens next. Suddenly, a peaceful peasant family who previously just grew their own wheat and traded favors with neighbors has a massive problem.
Because they need the coins.
Yes. If they don't get their hands on one of those silver coins by tax day, the king's guards will throw them in prison or take their land or sell their children into slavery.
So how do they get the coins? The only people who have them are the soldiers.
Precisely. The peasants have to go out and actively seek out the soldiers. They have to offer the soldiers things the soldiers want: wheat, wine, clothing, cooked meals, in exchange for those silver coins.
Mind blown. The king has, in one single stroke, turned his entire national economy into a vast, decentralized machine for provisioning his soldiers. He doesn't have to build supply wagons. The peasants will bring the food to the soldiers voluntarily just to get the coins to pay the tax.
Yes. Markets are brought into existence as a side effect of taxation and military logistics. The state created the market to feed the army.
And this creates what the author calls the military coinage slavery complex. Can you walk me through how those three things feed into each other?
Let's look at Alexander the Great as an example. He had an army of roughly 120,000 men. To pay them, he needed half a ton of silver a day, just for wages.
Half a ton of silver a day.
So continuous war generates an immense, unceasing demand for coinage. Coinage requires precious metals. Extracting those precious metals requires deep, dangerous mining. Ancient mining was essentially a death sentence. It required massive amounts of expendable labor. It required slaves.
And how do you get thousands of new slaves to work the mines?
Through more war. You conquer neighboring territories and enslave the population to work the mines, to mint the silver, to pay the army, to go conquer more territory. It's a terrifying, self-perpetuating loop of violent extraction.
This completely shatters the modern liberal assumption I've always heard, which is that the free market and the state are these diametrically opposed forces. We always hear debates about big government versus free markets. But historically, you're saying they aren't enemies. They are twins. They were born together out of the same violent necessity.
Yes. The violence of war created the exact conditions necessary for impersonal exchange. When a heavily armed mercenary buys food from a local peasant, they don't want to enter into a long-term web of mutual obligation with that peasant.
Right, because they might be marching off to die tomorrow.
They want to hand over a piece of silver, get the food, and walk away clean. Violence, and the implicit threat of violence behind the tax collector, is what makes that cold, impersonal arithmetic possible.
Okay, so to truly grasp the tragedy of this military coinage slavery complex, we really have to understand what it replaced and what it destroyed. What happens when a society that views humans as priceless collides with an invading society that puts a price tag on literally everything?
This brings us to a very profound distinction the author makes between commercial economies, which is what we live in now, and what he calls human economies.
A human economy. What does that look like in practice?
Let's look at groups like the Lele people of Central Africa or the Tiv in Nigeria that we mentioned earlier. These societies do have forms of money. The Lele use woven raffia cloth. The TIV use brass rods, but they rarely, if ever, use this money to buy everyday goods like yams or shoes.
Right. The notes describe it as a social currency. They use it for major life events, to arrange marriages or to settle blood feuds if someone gets killed. And here's what I found really beautiful and fascinating. If you look at the physical objects they use as social currencies in these human economies, they're almost always things used to adorn the human body.
That's a crucial observation.
They use beads, shells, rare feathers, pigments for makeup. They're items that make someone look beautiful, mature, dignified. They are things that signify someone is a unique social being within the community.
And contrast that with commercial economies. A commercial economy uses faceless, uniform chunks of silver or gold. A gold coin has no history and no unique identity. You can melt it down, and it's exactly the same as any other ounce of gold. But a string of ancestral beads carries the history of everyone who wore it.
That's a huge difference.
The French anthropologist Philippe Ross-Babet developed a fascinating theory about why human economies use these specific items.
What's his theory?
He argues that in human economies, primitive money is not a way to actually pay a debt. It is a symbolic acknowledgement of a debt that cannot possibly be paid.
Let me make sure I understand. Because a human life is an absolute value.
Exactly. Think about what a human being actually is in a tight-knit community. A person is a unique nexus of relations. A woman is a sister, a daughter, a mother, a mentor, a friend. If someone is accidentally killed in a feud, or if a woman leaves her family to be given in marriage to another clan, there is a massive tear in the social fabric. No amount of brass rods or raffia cloth can actually equate to the value of that unique person.
Because you can't replace a mother with a pile of brass. It's mathematically impossible.
Right. So the money given in these situations isn't a payment, it's a placeholder. It's a symbol acknowledging that an unpayable debt exists and that a relationship must be maintained to honor that gap.
But then history happens. These intricate human economies get dragged into the orbit of expanding commercial economies, and the results are catastrophic. The text goes into deep, harrowing detail on the Atlantic slave trade. Can we walk through exactly how the math of debt facilitated that horror? Because it wasn't just Europeans showing up with nets. It was an economic infection.
It was profoundly economic. European merchants arrived on the West African coast, and they brought their commercial arithmetic logic with them. They wanted human beings to sell across the Atlantic, but they didn't just invade, they used debt. They started injecting massive amounts of currency, specifically brass rods and European manufactured goods, into places like the Cross River area. They advanced these goods to local African merchants on credit.
Okay, so they essentially flooded the market with easy credit. What was the catch?
The local merchants had to pay back the European captains in slaves by a certain date. But there was no centralized state or police force in the interior to enforce these debts. So the merchants instituted a terrifying practice called penyaring.
What is penyaring?
It was a system of legalized kidnapping. If someone owed a debt to the merchants and couldn't pay, the merchants or their agents would just sweep into the debtor's village and kidnap anyone they could find. They would take the debtor's family or even just the neighbors who had nothing to do with the debt and hold them hostage or sell them directly to the Europeans to clear the ledger.
That is horrifying. The entire village lives in terror because one guy took out a loan.
It destroyed the social fabric. The merchants also demanded pawns. These were human collateral. A local merchant who took an advance of goods from a European ship would have to hand over his own children or his dependents as pawns to the captain.
His own children.
If the merchant didn't return with the required number of slaves before the ship was scheduled to sail, the captain would just sail away with the pawns, selling the merchant's own children into slavery in the Americas.
It's the absolute perversion of the social fabric. To make the math work, to ensure the ledger balances, you have to systematically destroy people's humanity.
The math of this shift is truly terrifying if you look at it analytically. In a human economy, we said a person is priceless because of their web of relationships. To make one woman equivalent to a generic bar of camwood or a specific handful of brass rods, she must be ripped entirely from that web. It takes an enormous amount of systematic, physical, and psychological violence to tear a person from their context so completely that they lose all their unique social ties and become a generic, quantifiable unit of value.
They are reduced to a number on a cargo manifest.
That is the exact definition of a slave in this context. A person violently transformed into a measurable quantity.
And this is the part of the deep dive that really sent me reeling. This violent quantification of human life. This idea that a human can be a thing on a ledger. It didn't just vanish when the slave trade was formally abolished in the 19th century. This logic didn't disappear. It is written right into the DNA of our modern legal system and our deepest, most cherished concepts of what freedom actually means.
Yes, to understand why we think the way we do today, we have to trace this logic back to the Roman roots of law. Roman law is incredibly important because it is the foundation for almost all of our modern Western legal and constitutional orders, especially regarding contracts, torts, and property.
But Roman law has some quirks, right?
It has notoriously quirky, almost paradoxical features, and the most glaring of these is the Roman definition of property, which they call dominium.
Let's unpack dominium, because the definition sounds normal to us at first. It's defined as the absolute power of a person over a thing, which is how I think about my car or my laptop. But legally, the author points out, it's a massive paradox. Can you explain the desert island thought experiment?
Certainly. Think about what a legal right actually is. A right is an agreement between people. Now imagine you are stranded alone on a desert island with a palm tree. Do you own the palm tree in a legal sense?
I mean, I guess I can chop it down if I want. But there's no deed.
Right. You can't have a legal relationship with an inanimate object. The palm tree doesn't know you own it. The concept of ownership only matters if there are other people around to contest it. Ownership is a relationship between you and other people regarding the tree. It's a right to exclude others. So the legal historians ask, where did the Romans get this bizarre idea of a relationship consisting of absolute unilateral power over a thing?
And the answer is incredibly dark.
Yes. Orlando Patterson, a prominent sociologist, provides the most historically convincing explanation. He argues that the concept of dominium emerged strictly from the master-slave relationship. In early Roman law, a slave was legally defined as a res.
A res meaning a thing.
It's literally a thing. So the original thing over which a Roman citizen had absolute legally sanctioned power was not a piece of land or a chariot. It was another human being. The Romans took the horrific logic of slavery, the absolute power of life and death over a person stripped of their social context, and they eventually extended that logic outward to apply to land, jewelry, and property.
So our fundamental legal concept of owning property is basically copy-pasted from the legal concept of owning a human. That is chilling. But it gets even darker when you look at how the Romans defined freedom, right? The word libertas.
Yes, the evolution of libertas is perfectly mirrored. Originally, in the ancient world, to be free meant to have friends, to have civic ties, to belong to a community. It meant you had a network of people who would stand up for you. It was the exact opposite of a slave. A slave was defined by what Patterson calls natal alienation, being violently ripped from your homeland, your family, and having no social ties whatsoever.
Or freedom meant connection.
Originally, yes. But over time, the Roman jurists redefined freedom. They started defining it as the natural power to do whatever one wishes, as long as it isn't prevented by force or law.
Which, if you think about it, sounds exactly like the absolute power of the slave master.
Exactly. Freedom became defined not by your connections to others, but by your absolute power to do what you want, isolated from the demands of others. The ideal of freedom shifted from being a deeply connected community member to being an isolated master of your own domain. We see this brilliantly mirrored in the patriarchal household of ancient Rome.
The paterfamilias, I've heard that term, the head of the family.
Yes, but look at the etymology. The Latin word familia, from which you get family, actually derives from the word famulus, which literally means slave.
Wait, a family originally meant a collection of slaves?
In the legal sense of the Roman household, yes. The early Roman father, the paterfamilias, had absolute dominion over his entire household. He legally had the right to physically punish, sell, or even execute his own children, his wife, and his slaves. His authority was absolute, isolated, and unquestionable.
Okay, this brings me to a really probing question about how we think today, because this isn't just ancient history. In modern society, we constantly use the phrase, "I own myself." It's the basis of our bodily autonomy. It's the basis of our property rights. It's my body, I own it. But if ownership dominium is derived directly from the master-slave relationship, does this mean that when we say we own ourselves, we are splitting our own identity in two? Are we casting ourselves as both the master and the slave at the exact same time?
That is a brilliant deduction, and it is exactly what happened philosophically. And it had profound historical consequences. Let's walk through how this evolved into the modern world. Natural rights theorists in the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment influential thinkers like James Gerson and later Thomas Hobbes used this exact Roman logic to build the foundations of modern political thought.
What did they argue?
They argued that if we own our natural rights and our freedom, just like we own a piece of property, then it logically follows that we have the right to give them away or even sell them.
Wow. So by defining freedom as a piece of property that you own, you actually create the legal loophole to eliminate your own freedom.
Precisely. This logic was weaponized for centuries. It was used to justify debt peonage, saying a person freely chose to sell themselves to pay a debt. Thomas Hobbes used it to justify the absolute authoritarian power of the state, arguing that citizens had contracted away their liberties to the sovereign for protection.
Because if you own your liberty, you can trade it for security.
Right. And eventually, this exact same philosophical framework became the justification for modern wage labor.
How so?
Because in wage labor, you are essentially renting your freedom out by the hour. You are selling your time and your bodily autonomy to an employer for a set period. All of it stems from an ancient Roman legal concept designed to manage populations of conquered, enslaved people. It normalizes the idea that human energy and time are quantifiable commodities that can be bought, sold, and enforced through contracts.
It is incredible how deep these roots go. So zooming out from Rome, I want to look at the massive 5,000-year timeline Graeber lays out in the text. He proposes this grand macro-historical framework. He argues that human history essentially functions like a giant pendulum. It swings back and forth over thousands of years between two distinct financial realities. And the swing of this pendulum is dictated entirely by the presence or the absence of one thing trust.
Yes, the cycles of history. He divides it into periods of bullion versus periods of credit.
Let's look at the periods of bullion first. This is when gold and silver coins dominate everyday life. The text notes that these eras like Axial Age China during the Warring States period, Iron Age Greece and the height of the Roman Empire are invariably periods of generalized violence, massive standing armies, and widespread chattel slavery. Why do coins and violence go hand in hand?
There is a very practical, mechanical reason for this. Coins are the perfect currency for mercenaries, soldiers, and looters because they do not require trust. Think about a debt or a credit ledger. A debt is a record of a relationship. It requires a community to enforce it. But a physical gold coin, it is an object without a history. It doesn't care who holds it.
Right, a mercenary can sack a city, loot a gold cup from a temple, melt it down into coins, and walk into a tavern 3 countries away, and the bartender won't ask where he got it. The gold is just gold.
Exactly. When the world is violent and unstable, when armies are marching and borders are collapsing, social trust evaporates. Credit systems break down because you don't know if the person who owes you money will be alive tomorrow or if the court enforcing the debt will still exist. In those eras, people demand cold, hard physical metal. The period of bullion is an era of high anxiety and low trust.
But then the pendulum swings. The empires collapse, the standing armies dissolve, and you get periods of credit.
Yes. These emerge during times of relative social peace, or when massive, overarching religious or transnational institutions step in to build vast networks of trust. The best example is the Middle Ages.
Which we usually think of as the Dark Ages, but financially they were highly advanced, right?
Very much so. You had the Catholic Church in Europe and vast Islamic merchant networks spanning from Spain to Indonesia. Because these religious institutions enforced a shared moral code, trust returned. And when trust returns, physical coins largely vanish from everyday circulation. Money becomes virtual again. It becomes ledgers, tally sticks, and complex bills of exchange.
I found the detail about the Middle Ages fascinating. In that era, credit was deeply, intimately tied to personal reputation.
Absolutely. The modern concept of a credit score is an impersonal number. In the Middle Ages, your credit was your moral standing in the community. If you were known to be dishonest or cruel or a drunkard, no one would extend you credit. You were quite literally a man of no account.
But then, according to the timeline, we hit the capitalist era, starting around the year 1700 and running to the present day, and the pendulum swings back toward an empire of debt, but with a strange modern twist. It's not just kings minting coins anymore.
No, it's the marriage of state military power with high finance. The text points out a detail that often gets glossed over in standard economic histories. The very first modern stock markets didn't emerge to fund peaceful tech startups or local businesses. They were created to fund massive, violent military ventures.
Like the East India Company.
Yes, the Dutch and British East India Companies were essentially heavily armed, private mercenary fleets. Sailing a galleon to Asia to extract spices and textiles was incredibly dangerous and expensive. A single merchant couldn't bear the risk of a shipwreck or a pirate attack. So they created joint stock companies. They sold shares of the future loot to investors in London or Amsterdam.
So they were crowdfunding imperialism.
Exactly. And at the same time, modern national debts were created for a very specific reason: to buy gunpowder. European kings realized they could fight much larger wars if they borrowed money from wealthy merchants, promising to pay them back with future tax revenues. The Bank of England was founded essentially as a mechanism for a syndicate of bankers to loan the king money to fight a war with France.
Okay, so this raises a really important question, one that gets to the very heart of the author's macro-historical view. If we followed the pendulum, historically, an age of virtual money, an age of credit, meant a movement away from war and slavery. It meant building institutions based on trust, and critically, building institutions to protect debtors.
Yes, that is a key historical pattern. In ancient Mesopotamia, which operated on complex credit systems, kings used to regularly issue clean slate decrees. When debts piled up too high and families were being forced to sell their children into debt peonage to survive, the king would literally declare all consumer debts forgiven. He would wipe the slate clean and return the debt servants to their families.
Because if he didn't, the society would collapse or the peasants would revolt.
Exactly. The system recognized that the survival of the community was more important than the math of the ledger.
So here's my question. Today we live in the ultimate age of virtual money. Everything is electronic credit. So why are we seeing global institutions like the IMF doing the exact opposite of those ancient kings? Why are our modern institutions structured almost entirely to protect the creditors and enforce structural coercion on the debtors, even if it means entire countries starve?
That is the ultimate crisis in perception that the text points to. The structural violence of the modern system, the military backing, the threat of starvation, the state enforcement has completely vanished behind the moral language of personal responsibility. We've criminalized debt so thoroughly in our culture that paying one's debts has become the ultimate moral imperative for the individual.
While the institutions themselves play by completely different rules.
Precisely. Massive states and financial institutions manipulate currency, bail out failing banks with taxpayer money, and flood markets with quantitative easing without facing any of the moral hazard they preach. When a bank fails, it's a systemic risk that requires a bailout. When a citizen can't pay their medical debt, it's a moral failing that requires bankruptcy and ruin.
It is a profound disconnect. It's like we are living under the math of a military empire, but we've been convinced it's just a neighborhood exchange of favors.
And again, to be clear, this is the author's systemic historical analysis of how these institutions have evolved over millennia. But it forces us to look at the mechanics of our current economy and recognize the historical echoes. When you see a global supply chain or a sovereign debt crisis, you are seeing the legacy of the military coinage slavery complex, adapted for the digital age.
Okay, to recap this incredible journey you asked us to take. Debt is not some universal moral truth that fell from the sky like gravity. It is an arithmetic abstraction. It was born out of the necessity of war, the brutality of ancient slavery, and the logistical nightmare of state building. The next time you look at a student loan statement or a mortgage, or hear a politician pontificating on the news about the sacred duty to pay the national debt, remember what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the visible surface of a 5,000-year-old system designed to take messy human social relationships and turn them into cold, enforceable arithmetic.
And I will leave you with a final reflection to mull over, one that builds on everything we've discussed. If debt is truly the perversion of a promise that has been corrupted by impersonal math and the implicit threat of institutional violence, what would a world look like where free men and women could make genuine promises to one another? What would our human relationships and our societies actually look like if they existed entirely outside the shadow of a ledger?
That is a staggering question to end on. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Keep questioning those systems, and we'll have another stack of your sources ready for the next deep dive.